You hear me?
All right, so thanks everyone for coming out tonight. Angular meetup, pretty fun. Kevin's going to talk to us about some NestJS, Swagger, and TypeScript. So here's Kevin.
Thank you. I was holding off until you got here, Michelle. Thank you for coming.
Ready, go.
Go. Grab a sandwich. Thank you all. I know we've been talking briefly before any of this started about DevUp. I will introduce a whole bunch of things tonight, including myself and who I work for, and you, these guys here tonight, work for me and got me started on all of this stuff. My name is Kevin Grossnicklaus. We are going to talk about some TypeScript, JavaScript. We're going to talk about server-side API stuff tonight, which may be somewhat unusual at an Angular meetup where the discussions are generally focused on the browser and client-side SPA framework, such as Angular, but there's a method to the madness. We do custom development of projects. So a little bit about us and why I'm here tonight. We are a big Angular shop. We do a ton of front-end Angular work at Architect Now. We are located out in West County. Our backends have traditionally been ASP.NET Core, ASP.NET, MVC, Node, just lots of different things on the back end. Lately, we've expanded more, and we've got some Java projects and some Python projects, a lot of different things. We're not a huge development shop. We got 9, 10 employees, and we do mobile development. We do web development. We teach a lot of workshops, classes. People pay us to come and learn about X or Y. We were talking about a conference that's here in St. Louis called DevUp. I've been involved, and my team has been involved in that for many years. That is coming up here October 8th, 9th, and 10th. I have some coasters if you want them. They're sitting around on the table. At DevUp this year, I'm also giving on October 8th on a Monday. If you're interested, DEVCONF, devupconf.org is the website. There's an all-day of workshops, and I'm talking about Angular. I bring that up only because I'm in an Angular meetup. The Angular workshop that we're going to talk about there is much different than tonight, and it's all an introduction to Angular, TypeScript, Webpack, Angular Forms, Redux, lots of stuff going on with that. That said, let me make sure my screen is shared. What do I need to do that?
The left side.
What we're going to talk about tonight, is a framework called Nest. So, as I mentioned earlier, we've done a lot of different things. Our general architecture at Architect Now is very API centric. So we build front ends generally in Angular, some React. You know, obviously we've lived through lots of different technologies. The back end is always some JSON in, JSON out, HTTP standard API. If I were to weigh all of our projects, it would be heavily weighted towards ASP.NET, C#, ASP.NET Core, MVC, lots of JSON in and out, lots of Swagger-enabled frameworks. Year ago, not even a year ago, 8 months ago, we had a project come along, and I personally got involved finding some Node frameworks that provided similar functionality to that which I got out of C#. Not that I hated C#, I have nothing against it. Everything I'm going to show you tonight, everything we're going to talk about tonight is not 100% of what we use. We have some huge projects that use this technology stack. I use it every day on the ones that I'm involved in. We also have other massive projects that are still, in my world, C# and ASP.NET Core. I got heavily involved in a couple Node frameworks that did something similar. I found myself in Nebraska speaking, not quite Nebraska. I found myself in Iowa at a conference called Nebraska Code, but it was still in Iowa, which I will call them out until the day I die. But I was sitting at a speaker table coding away on an API, and one of the speakers next to me looked at me and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm working on an API for a project that we have ongoing." We got to chatting about my technology stack, and this guy is like, "I can't even believe you're doing that. You should be looking at NestJS." Because I have a coworker in my team all uses NestJS. He asked me, he said, "What do? What does your team generally specialize in on the front end?" I said, "TypeScript, TypeScript, JavaScript, Angular. We're big in it. We've spoken here at this particular meetup many times. So we said, if that's your background and you're doing what you're doing, you should throw it away right now and use Nest. So me and another coworker of mine, Chris Young, were like, fair enough. I Google this thing while I'm sitting there, because when you're out networking and you get that kind of feedback, take it for what it is, and it's likely true. I started doing some research, and I'm like, this is what we should be using. So over the next couple of days, I drive back to St. Louis. I port my entire project from the framework I was using over to NestJS. I've since become a convert and a huge fan, and we've got a number of our big projects right now that use this framework. That said, what are we going to talk about tonight? We are going to talk about a framework called Nest. It is nestjs.com. I'm going to share with you a bunch of resources. I'm going to show you what we do. I'm going to start some projects. I'm going to discuss lots that goes in, a significant amount that goes into all of this. First off, if you're an Angular, how many of you are Angular TypeScript developers? 1, 2, you're at the Angular meetup. Good for you, 3 or 4. The reason that I fell in love with this is because what we do a significant amount of is on our front-end browser-based user interfaces, we use Angular. We use the new Angular, not AngularJS, not Angular 1.5. We use the new Angular. We use TypeScript, comes out of Google. It has components, it has dependency injection, it has modules, it has all of those things, and we're comfortable with it. Uses Webpack. There's a lot that Angular provides. On the back end, we used a totally different technology. So in my world, sometimes there was a developer that focused only on the front end. Sometimes there were developers that focused only on the back end. More often than not, you played play, right? You knew enough C# to do the back end API stuff. You knew enough front end to write the front end code. With Nest, those two worlds somewhat come together. So to describe a little bit about our projects, when we build a project, we're a big Git shop. We follow Git flow. We generally have 3, lately, with some variation, 3 repos per project. So we version them separately. Say we have a mobile front end, we will have a Git repo for the mobile assets. The mobile team will have their own repo, their own version number. They might be on version 1.1.2. We have a web repo. If somebody is using Angular and they're building a front end in the web, that is the repo they will have in Git. They version 100% separate than the mobile team and from the API team. We will have an API repo. The API repo is what we're talking about tonight, the Nest stuff, TypeScript, JavaScript, Node, server-side stuff, that the data access, all of that type of stuff. They deploy separately and they version separately. What I mean by that is we set up completely different hosting environments. The mobile stuff has its own distribution. We're a big Microsoft App Center TFS shop where we work. So if it's a mobile app, App Center deploys Android and iOS. All our testers, all our users get deployments out of there. If it's a front end, say it's a dashboard, we'll have a dashboard.client.com. That'll be all the Angular front end stuff. That goes out to a separate URL, separate domain, separate hosting. That hosting is very, for lack of a better term, dumb, meaning those files just get served up. There's no server-side anything. It's a file share. If you request a JSON file or you request a .js file or any other type of bundle, they're going to get served up by a dumb web server in some type of content delivery network. The Nest stuff is the API. It would be an api.client.com, a completely separate place. We obviously turn on cross-site scripting and cores and all of that. But the API stuff is this infrastructure, and that sits somewhere where there's server-side code. Lately, it's been a lot of Docker containers. It's been Kubernetes, Docker, big clusters of Node servers, of Linux servers running all of this stuff on the back end. So what is Nest? And I didn't bring this up earlier. If you guys have a question or if I'm running through something, I'm throwing out a lot of 50,000-foot level stuff before getting to this to kind of set the stage. But if you do have a question, feel free to raise your hand and ask. Yes?
So I want to know what it is that this guy recommended to you that's better than what you're doing before. Or will you demonstrate that?
Okay, I will. So what I was, you know what I was doing before, because my background has traditionally been a lot of Microsoft stuff. Even when we went to Angular, heavy on the front end, that we still had an anchor over in the Microsoft world. If we were to access a database, we're a big Mongo shop, but we still have a lot of SQL Server. We're writing server-side logic. That was always, to me, just because of where I came from and what I did, more Microsoft-focused stuff. When I shifted over here, it was because, wow, we're really good at doing the front end and TypeScript. I became a big fan of TypeScript early on. And Nest looks like Angular. It functions like Angular. It has the same modules, has the same dependency injection, has a lot of the same stuff. Now, our Nest code never intermingles with their Angular code. I will say that. Could we share logic? Yes, we could. We do not. I think in the future, I'd like to do more. We just don't. But what is Nest? It's a progressive Node.js framework. Anybody here do Node, by the way? Any Node developers? A few of you? So obviously in the Node world, huge ecosystem, right? There you can use Express, you can use all kinds of web servers in the Node world. You pull in NPM packages for anything you need to do. So Node is a server-side runtime and ecosystem for JavaScript, is traditionally what it's been. Now, when TypeScript came out, TypeScript started to evolve into that space, regardless of Nest. Nest brings a lot of that infrastructure to play, TypeScript and others, with Express, and makes developing a API in your server-side code much easier. And they build it in such a way that it feels very comfortable and works much like you would expect if you were an Angular developer. So what does that mean? I'm going to skip ahead a section and just show you some very simple sample code. Whoops. Easiest, and I'm going to jump around between IDEs tonight. I'm sorry for that, but I'm going to jump between. We use WebStorm. We're a big JetBrains shop, so all of my team uses WebStorm for our front end or back end now. But I actually have Visual Studio Code open right now. If you are an Angular developer, you are familiar with the concept of what I call attributes, but you could see them up here. You can tag classes or functions with some attribute that means something using the new, I believe it's called that, not directives. What is the term in Angular? I get so used to calling it attributes, it's something else. Decorators. Annotations, decorators. They have different, depending on who you talk to, they're called something different. But this particular class that I have here, and I will zoom in if I can. Maybe I can't. I got a new laptop, so there you go. This particular class is the simplest example. This is one that will be created, or you can clone Nest. I'll talk about where you get it and how you get resources and all that stuff in a second. First concept you're going to hear in Nest is a controller. If you're a Microsoft person or your background has anything to do with ASP.NET, C#, you're going to hear the same thing. This is a sample project here that has a cats controller. They're just serving up a simple single endpoint that returns data. It's a class. It's TypeScript. Familiar? They have some annotations up here at the top. They have a controller. This tags it as being a controller, and this also gives it the name of the controller. This is how your URL routing will work. So if somebody is calling this API, they're going to look for the cats URL, and anything that comes after that is going to route into. Again, I use terminology that may or may not be familiar to you, but they're going to route into what I would consider an action method, but it's just done here in TypeScript. Down here, they have a find all. I have a get. I could put something in here, get cats, whatever I want. They would go to whatever my root URL is, /cats, the name of the controller, /get cats, and it would hit this endpoint. The routing is done for you. It's very similar to any other framework that you might look at that has some way of doing this. Everything in now I'm showing kind of out of the box here where they use promises. You can also, there's ways of using observables as well if you're in ArcsJS or you're using a promises library. But the fact that this particular TypeScript method is called find all versus this get, this decorator here is the overriding. That is what a URL would route to. Nest handles all the routing. You don't have to do anything. You simply slap this thing up here. Obviously, if you see the get, it supports puts, post, deletes, gets. Anything you want to decorate a method with, it will route in there. Async, natively built in. It returns, this particular promise returns a cat. I'll show you in a second, I'm giving you the sneak peek here, and then we'll walk into some more advanced examples. But cat is some type of model that represents a cat, and it's an array of them. That's the TypeScript syntax. Inside of the logic here, line 35 of this particular sample, it's using a cat service. So we don't do all of our data access right here. Some other functionality that's testable, that's some service in the back end does the work. How does that happen? Much like Angular, this service is injected. Exactly like, when I say much like Angular, almost to the T like Angular. Somebody wrote a service down here, they flagged it as injectable, and that service goes through a dependency injection process exactly like Angular. No difference. There is a module. This module says, I'm a module. Guess what? Looks like Angular. It has a controllers. This is the controllers. Controllers in the Nest world are the front-end endpoints that HTTP and JSON hit. It also has providers. It has filters. It has other stuff that you can put in here, just like if I was here talking about how to set up a front end for Angular. In this particular example, it's very simple. There's a controller, a single controller, cat's controller, a single provider, cat's service, and there's no logic. I'll show you an example here in a bit with some logic. And then there's a unit test, but the cat itself, let me go back to this. The data type that is returned, find hold on. Here's an interface. So if you're a TypeScript person, you're used to doing Angular, you've written models, you can use interfaces, you can use classes, you can do quite a significant amount of stuff on the front end. Same difference on the back end. So I'm going to show you some examples here in a minute where you create your models. It's an MVC pattern, right? You've got models. These are your data transfer objects, something that does something. Well, we use Mongo, so the examples I'm going to show tonight, as I might have posted elsewhere, are going to save and persist stuff to Mongo. But whether you're saving to MySQL, to SQL Server, Mongo, whatever your data store is, we use Redis, we use a lot of different things on the back end. Ultimately, we don't write manual JSON out there. We create TypeScript classes or TypeScript interfaces that represent the data in our world. And we decorate those things with attributes that tell Nest how to treat them if they are being sent into an API or being returned from an API. What are required, what's not required, how should infrastructure like Swagger treat them, what would be an example of value. All of that stuff is done for us through Nest and some of its decorators. There are some things I'm not going to talk about a significant amount tonight, but I do want to point them out because I said, and if you're talking about Nest, just like if you're talking about Angular, you're going to hear the term modules. We're going to talk about modules. We're going to talk about, whereas Angular has components, there's no such thing as components in Nest. In Nest, they're called controllers. In Angular, the component term is meant to represent some component that represents a piece of your user interface. There's no user interface in the Nest world. It's a back-end thing. It runs on the server only. So they have controllers. Controllers are your inputs and outputs. It's the functions. The controller level are essentially the classes that serve as all of the endpoints that JSON hits. HTTP posts, puts, whatever. From that standpoint, there's a lot of other similarities. They have guards, they have interceptors, there's some middleware, pipes. Terminology is similar between Nest and Angular, but sometimes the implementation slightly differs. And I'm not going to go into a lot of those tonight, but There are pipes if you need to do certain type of validation. I will show a few of those. Guards. In Angular world, you would put a guard on a component to, if you're doing routing, you could put a guard on a component, say from a security standpoint, only users in this role can see this component, or things of that nature. Similar functionality in Nest, except you're locking down from a security standpoint an endpoint. You're saying only admins should be able to set this data. Only users in this role should be able to read this data. So you're locking down endpoints in Nest. So they've used similar terms and made functionality as similar as they can get them across the whole plane. There's decorators if you want to write your own decorator tag. Like here, the example that they have here is a decorator called roles. If I wanted to turn on that decorator and say, do I have it anywhere? They don't have it. Oh, right here. This example says only admins should be able to call that. Now, how do you determine if they're admins? That's a security responsibility, correct? So a lot of security infrastructure involved in Nest. We use JOT tokens or JavaScript web tokens pretty significantly. So JOT tokens are going to get intercepted before this. I'm going to parse my JOT token. I'm going to say this user is valid, and this is the roles they're in. And then when it moves down the chain, it's going to look at that particular decorator and say, okay, this person's valid, yes, but they're not in this role, so I should return it unauthorized because that attribute didn't. So in the end, you're building, this is an HTTP post. Its name is create, or actually HTTP post simply to cats. And only people with the role admin should be able to do it. Notice there's also decorators in here. This particular post, the body of the post is mapped to this object, create cat DTO. Anybody here C# ASP.NET person? A few of you. This is exactly how ASP.NET Core does it. ASP.NET MVC does it this way as well. So the syntax for some of these attributes is nearly identical, or so close that it was very comfortable to my team. Before I skip ahead.
This might be a question for later, but are those decorators or attributes, they work with inheritance? So
yes, you can have
class.
You can have a base controller and inherit.
Create like base methods.
You can get really creative with it. A couple things. There is. I'm not even going to expand, make this. I don't know if I can. I can. There is a NestCLI. I've loaded it. I will skip ahead here a second. Just when I'm not skipping ahead. I'm just showing you. NestJS uses a similar npm package name syntax to Angular. If you're familiar with how Google named Angular, they put @Angular and the ampersand Angular / something. Nest did the same thing. So obviously they start with Nest, not Angular. So you'll be familiar with that. They're on their own. They broke everything up into modules, much like the Angular team chose to do. They also provide a full CLI. So if you wanted to start your own Nest project, it's very easy. I could say Nest new ng demo, and it's going to ask me for the npm stuff, and it will spin that up and create a project for me. I say this with some level of assumption that you're familiar with Angular CLI, because Angular CLI was built to do the same thing. The purpose behind the command line interface for Angular was to standardize how, I hate to say it, but it really was, standardize how all Angular developers work. Google and the industry and John Papa and everybody else said that people who develop Angular apps today using TypeScript and using all of these modules, there are some best practices you should follow. So they put out an Angular, they put out a bunch of wikis and all kinds of information on best practices. Nest decided to follow a similar pattern. I just picked yarn. Nest said, if you're going to use this platform, we're going to make your life as simple as possible. We're going to give you a command line tool for, number one, creating a new project, We will set up all the structure for you. We'll put all the controllers in the right place. We'll give you some sample models. We'll give you some sample services. We'll give you a default module. We will set up all of the lint, TS lint. We'll do your TS info and all of the, they use Prettier. They use for coding formatting. Let me open that project now that I've created it. This is the project I just created. They automatically, just through that CLI, they created a package.json for me and added all the most current packages and all the basic stuff I would need to get started. Is this enough to run with your whole project? No, you're going to add more to it. You're going to put a lot of server-side stuff here. They make no assumption about your data access or any of that or what you would do with caching. But they set up that. They set up a simple app controller. They set up a jest unit test for you. They set up a basic controller here that's just got get. They return hello world. They set up a Nest CLI just to give the CLI some context to what was used when it started. This would be how Angular works as well. Anybody here familiar with Prettier? Prettier is an NPM module that just formats JavaScript and TypeScript. They set up some Prettier standards for you. They set up package.json with a ton of scripts for you, how to do your deployments, how to run, how to link your project, how to test your project. They give you Webpack settings. They give you everything. They get you off to the races pretty far. We've grown from this, but it was we jumped down the racetrack farther than most in starting with this. They set up all your dependencies. This is pretty basic. NestJS common core dependencies, Jest, Rimraf, Webpack, all your Jest unit test settings, things of that nature. So without doing anything else, I could come down here and do an npm start. I could do an npm run. I could just do an npm start, would probably be the default. It'll spin up. It'll say Nest Factory. I'll go into some of the code here in a second, but without even doing that, I can run. This thing is sitting here listening on, not really sure where it's listening, port 3000. Here's the bootstrap. If I can show you how simple this is at the front. I mean, there's more to it, but essentially in my core function here, it says Nest Factory create. I give it a module. Think of this, if you're an Angular person, this is the bootstrapping of an Angular app. And then they say listen on port 3000. What does port 3000 do? I can go to localhost 3000. It says hello world. Seems stupid simple. It is stupid simple. It was meant to be an empty project for you to look at. How did this work inside of this app controller? App controller got injected through dependency injection and app service. Down here I have an app service that's tagged as injectable with a decorator. It's a simple class. It has a function called root that returns a string, and it returns the words hello world. And magically it runs. It seems trivial, but there's a lot of magic that went in to make that be a full JSON endpoint written in TypeScript and run in Node. If you've ever tried to set something like that up in Express or other frameworks, it's not really that simple. I mean, it could be, depending on what your background is. Let me kill this, make sure I can rerun in a different framework. If I did, oops, sorry, down here, let's back up a bit, npm run start dev. I did a slightly different npm script right here. I put start dev. If I were to go back, I'm again setting this up as a precursor to something else I'm going to talk about and use throughout the night here. Start dev runs nodemon. Anyone here ever use nodemon? Nodemon is an npm package that runs Node, except it also monitors your files. So anytime you change a file, it will restart. So think of it as a file watcher. We're used to running Webpack in Angular. If you're an Angular person right now and you do ngStart, that is what ngStart does. It's a file watcher. It uses Webpack. It watches all of your code. You change some code, and it'll automatically rebuild and refresh the front end. That's how Angular works. Nodemon is a way to do this on the server. So very similar development process. We use Nodemon for all of our development. So I've got this little hello world here, and if I hit refresh, it still says hello world. I'm sorry you can't see me hit the return key, but nothing magic happens. It still says hello world. If I come over here and go to my app service and I change this text, Evan is awesome, because that's what we should say, and save, I don't have to do anything else. Now I come back here and hit refresh. It automatically updates it. So my server-side development, as long as I'm running the NodeMon command line, works much like Angular. At least I am. My team is used to having an IDE up. They're changing their Angular templates. They're changing TypeScript. They're writing their client-side code. Something changes. Then they just go over to a browser, hit refresh, and the browser reflects those changes very quick. That's not as easy as it looks. There's a lot of magic that goes into it, because Webpack is recompiling, it's detecting changes in files and making this all happen. With Nest, they've got the same process for your server-side code. That is one reason I kind of like it. I mean, I'm not saying it's the only reason, but with .NET, I don't get that. I have to stop and rerun and recompile and attach debuggers and do all of that. Here, I can change in real time and just switch back over to a browser. When I say switch to a browser, I'm usually using Swagger. I'm looking at a front end. I'm using Postmon. I'm doing something that to hit my API, and that change is very quick to see. Again, just by using that CLI to create my project, they gave me all of these things. If I wanted to do a TS lint, they created a TS lint. And I'm running through some of these things, making the assumption you know what that means. Linting product, TS lint, in this case TypeScript, will scan your code and give you errors or warnings, or however you configure it, that says you didn't format your code correctly. I become a big fan of that. My linting rules right now are very hardcore, and some of the people that work with me struggle with that. We didn't always do that. Now, if I were to put this bracket down here, because that would fail my linting rules. You would not be able to commit code to Git in my world if that bracket was down there, because darn it, that bracket should just go on the first one. That's how we should all code. And I hate to be the guy that says that all of our code should look alike, but in some regards, it's cool that it does. In the big scheme of things, how could I make that? I could right click. I can't do it here, but I've got in my WebStorm, if I were over here, I could right click, and at the bottom of my thing, I could say reformat with prettier, and it would just put all the brackets in the right place. So it's not like we spend a significant amount of time fixing our code. If you've got a linting tool, IDEs will automatically reformat your code to match those linting rules. So even if people don't want to, somebody will just click a button and magically make all of our code look alike. So you might not want to write in French, but if you write in English, I could translate it to French with the click of a button. Not always perfect, but it works pretty easily.
You can also do like Git hooks. So right before they push code.
Yes, you can do it. Yep.
So like we use that here where developers will write whatever they want.
And then it just goes in. So it automatically, they give you, now I'm not saying you might be a linting expert, and you might say, I don't like how they did the linting rules that they create with this tool. Change them all you want. This was just created when the CLI created the new project, and it kind of has standards that this community has evolved to. All your TS config, how TypeScript works, the best way of setting all this up is all done for you. They give you prettier setup. They give you NodeMon setup. They give you a nice README with instructions on how to run everything and where it goes. You can tweak this or replace it with whatever you'd want. So there's a lot of work that went into setting up this default project. If I were here tonight talking about Angular itself, I would be telling you the exact same thing and what the Angular CLI does. This just happens to be a server-side CLI that does things slightly differently. One of the things that happens, there's builds, and you could start prod. It will run in production mode. We don't do it exactly this way, as you'll see in a minute, but it all works. In the end, the only reason you would do any of this is if you wanted to build a server-side API. You're going to act 99.999% of the time. If you were doing that, you're going to access data. Somebody's going to post, put, or otherwise send you data. You're going to save it somewhere. You're going to return data. It's going to be your queries. Everything about Nest is server-side. There's no HTML involved in any of this. It's all JSON in, JSON out. Before I get fancier in my examples, any questions? What do you guys use today to do JSON in, JSON out? So I know how to frame this stuff. Some of you said ASP, but a few of you. Java, Node, other Node. Java. What was yours? Okay, Go. Anybody else? A few of you guys I know are Nest. These two guys work with me.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So at any point, does Angular and Nest talk?
They're going to talk, obviously. Yeah, but well.
Just as much as you would with .NET Core or Java or anything.
Well, there's some differences here, though. So say you don't share any code. No code sharing. You've got a Nest project and you've got an Angular project. Obviously, the Angular project needs to call the API, right? Needs to load data, needs to log in. We do that. We expose a Swagger API, an open API, swagger.json file, and we use a number of tools. One of the tools we use heavily is we use NSwag. I know it says NSwag in terms of .NET. NSwag is a command line tool. You can point it at a Swagger API. It will generate you a C#, a TypeScript. It'll generate you any type of client to call an API. That said, there is the, I forget the name of the tool, so I'm going to Google it here really fast in front of everybody. It's written by the Swagger team. What is it called? CodeGen. There you go. Chow, I should have just asked you. Swagger CodeGen is the more adopted version that generates, they've got a list. So, well, I could just see it right here. If you wanted to generate Scala, Go, Groovy, if you had an API that exposed JSON that describes the API, what the endpoints are, what the outpoints are, what the URLs are, what the model, the data transfer objects, whatever you might call them, you can run this tool, point it at that URL, and generate yourself a client to call that. The reality is, if you're building APIs, you're very opinionated. There's no options. If you say that this endpoint requires a post and this is the input, and the input has these requirements in terms of validation, it is what it is. Different people can't choose to call it in different ways. That's the glory of tools like this. Once you have been opinionated and you say that, people just point this tool at your API and they get a strongly typed in their language and their platform of choice. So we do this all the time. So yes, our Angular runs this tool, points at the API. Then we get a nice little Angular class that we use to say, log in. Here's a username and password. It makes the call, returns an observable that resolves when the call's done, and we're done there. But on the flip side, if you take that a step further, if I'm using Nest on the server and Angular, new Angular on the client, I'm using TypeScript and the same development tools and the same NPM modules on both sides. So I can actually share all of a significant amount of services if I want, right? I can create an NPM package that both of them use. So now my client server can share the same code if necessary. There's times when that works. The client's not going to have the same data access code because that only makes sense in the context of running on the server. But and the server isn't going to have the same UI components and HTML and templates. That only makes sense on the client. But there are utility classes and other stuff that would work very well on both the client and server. And it's the same runtime in both the client and server, so you could do it. We have not, I will say in the 6 or 8 months, do you share much in anything that you got on the client and server? I don't.
Some utilities covers and stuff.
Yeah, I don't.
Because we use NSwag for the models. So
yep.
We don't actually share models.
Yeah, I'm the same way. Nothing that I do is shared. As much as I say that's possible, and I am intrigued by that, I think we will do that more. But the reality is right now we don't. We are able to generate all the code we need on the client using whatever. Anything else? Any other questions?
So by default, does it mean not returning JSON? Because I just saw the hello world or something. So by default, it's not returning.
Yeah, well, let me switch back to this. They're no, well, yes and no. Maybe I don't know back to Nest. There is to Swagger. Well, Swagger is generated. You'll see that in a second. Swagger is automatically going to get generated from the API anyway. There is tools like CodeGen will generate server-side code. I don't know if it'll do Nest. I didn't look in this list for Nest. No, it won't. It'll generate Go. You could generate, if you had API, it'll generate ASP.NET 5, ASP.NET Core. You could generate some server stuff. Nest is probably on the fringe enough that's not generating. If you had somebody else, now what's in a reality? Somebody has an API over here that exposes Swagger. I could point this tool at that API and generate my own server-side ASP.NET Core skeleton that matches theirs, right? If you wanted to be that person that was doing spoofing and, you know, send out fake URLs. I don't know what the use case of that would be. I know it exists, but we've only generated clients, never servers. All right. Jumping around a little bit here.
I'm sorry, I interrupted another question.
Was there a question interrupted?
Yeah, about
The
the
JSON by default that returns the JSON.
Oh, it will return JSON by default. The fact that this one didn't, let me show you this because I can very quickly. Cats controller. This particular one said return Kevin is awesome. If I made this an object, oh, it will return JSON. It'll post JSON in as well. It just happened to be it returned the native type that endpoint returned. So now if I come back here, wherever I am, it returns JSON. If you return a simple value, number, string, or otherwise, that's what's going to return. Generally, we always return. So when I build an API, now, again, I bounced around a bit tonight, but talking about the basics of what this is and why you would use it, how it looks like Angular and all of these things. When we build APIs, when I started to use Nest, I had a long list, a laundry list of things I needed it to do before I would even consider it. Security, validation, data mapping. I want, you know, JSON in, JSON out. We wanted to be able to inject services. We knew how good we were using this other technology stack, so there was no sense in ever even considering this thing over here unless it did everything the same way. And we actually got that. I'm not saying we got that 100 times better than what Microsoft does, but it's equivalent. Everything that I can do here, I can do here. And there's some things that make the development process that much faster and that much easier in this. One of those being that if you've got a team of people that are really good at Angular and TypeScript, they can work on the back end a little easier than jumping from TypeScript to C#. Now it's TypeScript, WebStorm. There's a lot that goes on that makes them even. So what we did, sorry, I'm making sure before I move on here, let me break up my little notes here. I'm not actually looking at my phone. I'm just texting my wife over here while I talk. But Swagger, we're a big Swagger shop. We've been using Swagger for years, since it was just starting. Right now you're on Swagger 3, and the interfaces and the capabilities of exposing Open API. Now it's called Open API. It used to be called Swagger, but more people are using the Open API term. We're a big NPM. Then another advantage, if you're a Microsoft C# person, you're using NuGet, you're getting NuGet packages. So there's this ecosystem of .NET developers that publish their libraries into a package management infrastructure called NuGet. If you're in TypeScript, JavaScript, other web platforms, it's Node's package manager, or Yarn. We use Yarn, but it's still coming from NPM. We like the ecosystem in NPM and Yarn as much, if not more. So it is nice that I could just grab, if I like Moment.js for doing dates, I can use it on the client, I can use it on the server. If I like X, I can use it on the client, I can use it on the server. Our infrastructure works the same way. What else before I jump on? Testing, I'll get into testing in a bit later. Prettier, talked about all that. I talked about modules, controllers, and services. Tonight, as I show stuff, those are the three terms you're going to see in some of my examples. Like I said, there's also filters, guards, interceptors, middleware, pipes, other plumbing that goes into Nest that's way beyond the scope of tonight. But it's similar to how Angular does it, but different. They're not rendering any user interfaces. They're rendering JSON. They're intercepting an input and modifying an output. That's why you would, if you want an interceptor, you might plug an interceptor in to log something. You could plug an interceptor in globally and say, I want to log every HTTP call out to Elma or some logging infrastructure if that was a need that you had. All right, I'm going to switch over. Eventually, maybe not. Well, I am switching. Yeah.
This being server side, how would it interface with? Is there any sort of protocol for that?
Oh, tons. So if you're not familiar with Node, Node is a command line tool. You can run Node from anywhere. I could come back here and just type Node, and Node will take me into a little environment here. Node is a command line JavaScript host. It's meant to run on a server. Node, it's very cool. I won't say my career started with Node, but it became big into Node recently. I can type Node and give it a JavaScript file. It will run that JavaScript file. Node handles all the eventing, all the file input and output, all of the network stack of listening. There's tons of libraries you can run in Node. So there are libraries for Node that are for Mongo, SQL Server, JavaScript. You could just download any Node package and use in your Node class if you wanted to access any type of data. Massive amount. There's actually, there's double, triple the amount of Node libraries than there are in the .NET space. .NET space tends to be more compact, but more highly adopted libraries. If you're a SQL Server person, you're using Entity Framework or something like that. If you're a Mongo person, the Mongo community has a .NET C# set of drivers. In the Node world, if you're a Mongo person, there's Mongoose and there's a handful, and some are extremely adopted. So it's never the case that any of my teams ever writes an API that doesn't access a database. Database access is extremely common. The examples I'm going to show you here in a second are all Mongo, just because that happens to be what we're working on frequently. So think of a Linux server, Mac, Windows server. When this Node environment runs, I've got, in my case, a startup class called main. And this is a bigger startup class than the example that I showed earlier. The one earlier was main TS. It really only did these 2 lines of code. It said, pick up that module and listen on port 30. I could run this pretty easily if I came down here. It's running, but if I could just type. Whoop. Sorry, let me hide this thing so you could see. Whoops. If I just type, where am I at here? I could say node source main TS. Whoop. TS node. Oh, I don't have TS node loaded. Never mind. You let this run. Whoop. Oh, there you go. That's why I keep you around. Forget this. TS node is a hybrid of Node that will, before it runs JavaScript, it will recognize TypeScript and just do the compilation to JavaScript. So it's just a abstraction of the Node library that will accept TypeScript as the input. Make sure I have it. I do have it. Gosh, I have a new laptop here, by the way. There we go. Yes, Node is loaded. Oops. There we go. There. Oh, it says it's in use, but I'll ignore that for now. I don't care. All I did was type TS node. Sorry, just to show you this one line right here, TS node. And then I gave it an input. That is, I mean, I hate to oversimplify Node to any of you, but Node is a server-side thing. How do we use Node today? We use it in Docker containers, right? So we have this like Linux distro that boots to Linux. And the first line that it does upon boot is run Node or TS node or something similar and kick off our server. What do I mean by our server? Usually our server is this main.ts. It's something that tells our server how to run. This is no different than if you're a .NET Core person that is using .NET, the new .NET exe for .NET Core. You do .NET in your executable. And it will run that executable, and that executable is usually an ASP.NET Core project that will spin up your web server stack. Gone are the days where we cared about Internet Information Server or IS, Apache. We don't care about any web server anymore. Weirdly enough, gone are the days of web server. We're spinning them up in their own infrastructure, and our code is building the stack that we need to run them. And the hosting environment for that varies, whether you're Mac, Linux, Windows, doesn't matter. It's up to me on the server to dictate what, or it's up to me in my code to dictate what's going on. So I'm going to switch over here. Wish I could get this a little bigger. I'll figure that out in a second. I'm in WebStorm right now with much smaller code. Maybe I will have to figure that out, but I can come here. There we go. A little easier. This is a project that I'm working on. So this is a Nest example. I'm going to use this example for a bit here, but this is, again, the bootstrap. It's much more complex than the 2 lines that were created by that CLI, but this is me starting a more robust API. What does this API look like? Is it running down here? It is running. If I were to come here and I were to look at this API, it's a Swagger. It's a Swagger front end. This particular Nest just has Swagger. It's extremely fast. I can log in. I can navigate every endpoint. I can try things out. This, if you're not familiar with Swagger, Swagger's the open API and the industry standard UI for just hitting endpoints. Now, if I wanted to use Postman, I don't even have Postman loaded. That's how new my laptop is, but get used to my old one. But this is the front end. If somebody just navigated to whatever my URL is /docs, you'd see this. What does that mean? This bootstrap, this startup, I have some stuff in here that is Express related. If you're new to Express, I grab Express. I use some out-of-the-box industry standard Express stuff that have nothing to do with Nest. One is Helmet, one is compression, one is cores. That's just me setting up a Node web server using the Express engine. Nest integrates with Express very well. So I can configure Express to do all the web standard stuff that I know Express does and the rest of the world uses. And at some point down here, I could say, I want to create a Nest app using this little factory. Here's my module. This is, again, very similar to how Angular kicks off. You give it a kickoff module, your root module, and you say bootstrap this thing. That's what I'm doing right here. I give it my Express. It'll make sure it uses Express and all its plumbing. I can give it some other options. I could tell it to turn on cross-origin requests if I want to accept API calls from anywhere. I can give it a logger if I want to log stuff out. I can set up some global filters. Again, I'm not going to get super detailed in all the very low level intricacies, other than to hope you can kind of infer some of the usability from some of this. I got some global exception filters I want to use. A few things. There's other ways of doing this. This thing right here is Swagger. I will tell you out of the box, the other project that I showed you, the original one we created here just earlier, had nothing to do with Swagger. There's no Swagger front end on this project. The Nest library ships with a Swagger is essentially an add-on. If I want to use Swagger, I have to add another NPM package. NestJS/Swagger. It's still them. Very similar to what Angular does. Angular gives you the basics. If you want to add on things and use other stuff, like you want routing, Angular does not install with routing. You have to choose to add that NPM package. Same with here. If you want Swagger, which most people do, but still they decided to publish it separately. If you want testing, you have to do that. We use Passport, NestJS/Passport for our JavaScript web tokens. If you want to set up microservices or WebSockets, you can load these. These are Nest plugins that use Socket.io to do some low-level socket communication if you opt to use it. But this is my project right here, the package JSON and the one I'm demoing here in WebStorm. Our NPM scripts look slightly different. We do some Docker stuff. We've evolved quite a bit from what comes out of the box with CLI. We've obviously got a lot more stuff that we use. Now, these are standard NPM packages. Some of these, a very small number of them, have some tie to Nest. Some of them were built by somebody who said, I'm going to build this NPM package and it's going to plug into Nest and help people that use this API framework build better APIs. Most of them, the vast majority, have absolutely nothing to do with Nest. If you use Nest to build an API, you can use any NPM packages you want. Any JavaScript you want. If you want to do data access and there's a way to do data access in any other Node library, you can do it. You can do validation any way you want to do it. Nest is highly extensible and really does not dictate what you use in the ecosystem outside of the core stuff that it takes. It's got its own common and core and a few things here. If you see the @NestJS, some of that is just out of the box that they provided you. Many of these other things down here, email validator, helmet, compression, cores, Bull, some of these are libraries that I'm just familiar with that I wanted to use, and they plug right into Nest. And you'll see what some of them do here in a second. Oops. For the most part, though, the rest of my setup here, the TSLint, the TypeScript setup, NodeMon, these are just out of the box, whatever came with the CLI. I just added a ton of files to it, so it became more. Obviously, one of the places I did is I set up a ton of controllers. I put all my controllers in a controllers folder, just like in Angular, you would have a components folder or some other hierarchy that you organized your files. So all of my controllers sit here. I've got a controller called award.controller.ts. Guess what the Nest people have? Naming convention standards, just like Angular has. So they have, instead of award.component.ts, they say award.controller. In here, expand this again. Eventually, I'll figure this out. Maybe I won't. Sorry. This particular controller has some data, use API. Notice it's hard to see up here, but there are some of these things. This particular line has some meaningful information. What do I mean by meaningful information? There we go. I guess I don't have to hold anything down. Some of these API bearer auth, API response, and API use tags, notice these particular decorators come from the Swagger library. You won't get them if you don't have this thing loaded. In my Bootstrap, wherever I was down here, this document builder, I switched back over to this options. This is me setting up Swagger. This is all it takes to set up Swagger. You just basically turn it on right here. You say, hey, I want to create Swagger. This is my title. This is my description. This is the version. Allow the end user to set the bearer auth through the UI if they want, so that somebody could come here and type authorize. And if they had a token, they could give you a bearer, whatever the token is. They enabled that simply by setting add bearer auth. I could set up some schemes. I wanted them to allow both HTTP and HTTPS because we secure everything with SSL. I could set the root host. That set host determines what this base URL is right here. And then build. Just by doing that, Swagger is enabled. I can say Swagger module, add Swagger with these options to Nest. So it's out of the box, kind of. You do have to add an little extra configuration because Swagger has its own stuff. That said, when you add the NestJS Swagger, they give you all kinds of extra decorators. We are very big into defining our Swagger docs. Our API not only has to accept the right inputs and return the right outputs, but that's only half the battle. The other half the battle is documenting what you accept and what you return and providing hints to other tools as to the data that should be expected. And that's where these other attributes come from. So in this award controller, just as an example, I set it up under the awards tag. That's a Swagger hint. The controller is called awards. Down here, I say API response. Anytime I return a 201, this is the data type that is expected. It is an array of those data types, and this is the description. What does this award controller mean? What does API response, API response, API response? If you get an operation failed, you're going to get this exception data. Why go through all of that? If I come down here and went into this particular thing, notice all of this text in the Swagger UI. It is saying if 201 comes back, that means operation successful. Where did that come from? I typed it in right here. If operation is successful, this is the data type you're going to get back. It even allows me to look at this model. You're going to get an array of these types. It allows me to see this model and all the properties of that model. Not only does it allow me to see it in this user interface, it allows other tools, other infrastructure, whether they're generating clients or giving another interface to see it all. If it was a fail, I'm going to get this back. I'm going to get login failed, these status codes. I'm going to get a nice exception that I would expect. I care a lot about not only when things are good, what I return, but I care about the exceptions. They should return meaningful information that my developers writing the front ends can see. And that includes enums and things of that nature where they can perform some logic. I don't want them to just hard code. If you return the word login failed, do something. So we return enums and codes and validation errors that are meaningful so that we can perform logic on the client. Use guards. This particular thing is me telling the Nest infrastructure, nobody should be able to call search on awards unless they are authorized. There's a JOT token. And I say JOT. If you're not familiar with that, it's a JavaScript web token, JWT. I went to a session once at a conference and a guy told me it was pronounced JOT, and I shall forever pronounce it JOT. He could have been lying to me, and he could have just started me down the right path. I have absolutely no idea. But it stuck with me. And I put this. Yes, he did. I went with it. So I'm going to call it JOT, and we're going to start this trend until it takes over. Roles guard, this is just me adding this guy and saying, hey, only administrators can call this. Again, I'm dictating via these little decorator security information. If code gets in here, this search method, it's an async method. Again, I like TypeScript and I like all the new async await infrastructure. It does a lot of work for me and it handles a lot of my promises and observable type code because I want to write async code and be very friendly on the server. So async await in the TypeScript world is very cool. This particular decorator says I want to pass one of the inputs into this method. I want to be the request object. The request object gives me access to a lot of things. I can get the URL, I can get the agent code, anything about the user making the request. In this particular case, since I have security turned on, by the time this request object is passed in, I can make the assumption that the user was validated, that there was a valid and encrypted JavaScript web token, and that it was decrypted and the entire user object is passed to me. So I know who's logged in. If I don't want any of that, this would be null, and I could just comment these lines out. Now, this would still work other than I wouldn't get anything back right here. And here I do expect it to be there. Again, I used async up here. Notice the return type is a promise. Everything is promises in the Nest world. You could use observables. I use promises kind of out of the box. All their sample code and everything else is promise-based. And then it's pretty standard code. I have injected a service at the top of this guy in my constructor. It's a TypeScript syntactic sugar. I got a private read-only award service, inject that guy. So my logic and my data access is all down here. This particular project, I'm using Mongoose to do a Mongo data access in my, figured that out, in my module, my root module. Look at all these. This is my, I've only got one module for this example. I could modularize this particular project. I can have whole features and other areas, controllers or whatnot, isolated into their own module. I'm not doing that. Everything is in one. What do I mean by everything is in one? I've got module, providers. Here's everything I inject. There's a lot of code in here. I've got a lot of code in this particular project. Here's all my in controllers listed here. There's a decent number of them. This is my app module. There is an interface called onModule init, similar to the lifecycle events or lifecycle interfaces of Angular. When this thing inits, I get a connection string and I connect to Mongoose. Mongoose is a node library for accessing Mongo databases and giving you very nice Mongo interaction. So we love Mongoose. I've gotten pretty good at using it. And then these are just me attaching to some events so that down here I can see really prettily that I successfully connected to Mongo. We're a Docker container shop. So when I say I got Mongo running, I've got Mongo and Redis cache running in Docker containers in a little isolated thing over here. As I mentioned to a few of you that got here early, got a new MacBook a week ago maybe, the biggest thing I've ever ran. 32 gig of memory, a terabyte hard drive, a terabyte SSD. They make computers today much bigger than they did before. I used to care about memory, not anymore. So I run Mongo and Redis and lots of stuff. And I've got tools. I cache everything now. Servers have always been that big. My laptop has never. I moved forward 8 years in the laptop space. And that's a lifetime. But if you go down all of these different things, custom API operations, I gave it a title. I want it to be called search awards up here. What does that search awards mean? That means when somebody looks at this, it says this nice little string here. Not only in this interface, but any other tool they use that is open API enabled, they're going to get documentation about what this thing should be. I can describe how it is. And they see, notice these VMs, just as terminology. In my world, we use view models. The terminology could be, some people call it DTO for data transfer objects. I'm not claiming that our way is the best way. You see a lot of different things out there in the wild. But these objects, everything is imported, standard TypeScript syntax. So this particular thing returns a collection of award VMs. Is array true? Award VMs. The input is game search VM. I'm just using this particular example. These are classes that I wrote in TypeScript in other parts of this project. If I look at this game search VM, this game search VM is export class, so it plays well in the module system of TypeScript. Notice every property here has an API model property. This again comes from the NestJS.swagger. This is me decorating my models, not just the controllers, but the models with individual properties of what Swagger should say and expect. Are they required? What examples? I could put descriptions. This is the game ID. I could put defaults. Hit enter here. So I go to a separate default. Anything. I'm decorating this particular thing with some information that has, I say it has no effect on the API, but it does. It does on how the clients are generated. It does have a lot of effect going downwind. If I were to refresh this, come back to this guy and look at my game search VM, this game ID now in the UI tells me this is the game ID, and that is the default that will be set. If somebody forgets to pass me that, it's going to now come in as 1, 2, 3 automatically just by me adding that attribute to the model. So I control all of this by the model. Another thing Swagger uses heavily I put all of my models in a folder called models, and view models all go in there, and view models. We're nothing if not original. Swagger or Nest, sorry, uses a library called class-validator. This is nothing that it's recommended and does install with Nest. The Nest development team did not write this. It's totally separate, but it is very cool. So if you look in NPM class-validator, Nest incorporates it and they provide plugins to take advantage of it. So in addition to these API model properties, I can come down here and put @isNumber and minimum of 0 and max of, in this case, I put 1,000,000 just to demonstrate this. So if anybody tries to call my API, regardless of the technology, they could be Ruby, they could be anything, Microsoft, if they try to pass a score in, and score is required for this particular thing, the default is 0. If they try to pass anything less than 0 or more than 1,000,000, they will immediately get an error before my code is ever even executed. So I can use these decorators to provide contextual information on what's required, what's not required. If something is a date, this thing here is a date. My example, I give them this, the current date as an example. It's a string. Date-time is the format. In this case, all of these, the fact that I wrote this out like this is very meaningful. All of the open API generators automatically read that metadata and generate nice date formats in Ruby and in Java, and it makes dates flow from my API down to the client very easily. If you're new to dates, dates are a beast, right? Trying to convert UTC dates up and down. That converts UTC dates down and up and supports Unix formats natively, and will handle all of the serialization for you. So very easy there. Dates become a non-issue because I'm able to tag it with that. IsString just says this user ID should be a string, has to be something. No real rules. I could put other rules inside of this class-validator NPM package. Nest automatically supports it, moves everything over. What does that mean to me? We build our models, our view models that we tag with VM, and we decorate them to say this is what's expected. Nest handles the validation and handles sending down a nice error message and backup. And it only gets to my code if all of these rules pass. If you've ever written your own validation rules, it's kind of tricky. You put it all over. There's just a lot of ifs, ands, and buts. This works very well for us. Questions about validation? You've all probably done it. It never is this easy, but it actually kind of is this easy. Does it always work perfect for us? No, because we forget these things. We forget to say required. We forget to add the question mark so that it's nullable. We spend a lot of time. Now, our view models, if I were to take this award, oh, yes?
You validate, I'm assuming some of your endpoints.
This automatically, these view models, that anything with us in my world, the way we've used it, we put VM at the end of every view model. Our controllers, everything here, the only thing they accept or return will have a VM, a VM, a VM. So everything here is validated in and out through that infrastructure.
Assuming that they might share a service or something.
But the back end, so only the view models. We use Mongoose for our data access. Mongoose, if I go back to award, I've got a library called award, or a class called award. Now there's an award VM, which has some attributes that determine the API ins and outs and validation. This award is what gets saved to the database. This, if you're a Microsoft guy, this would be your entity framework model, right? That C# is serialized to SQL Server and read back from SQL Server. We extend TypeGoose. That's a TypeScript version of Mongoose. Here we have these props that say index. This is an indexed property and it's required. This is what's saved to our database. We've got a tool. We use a tool pretty heavily called Studio 3T is our SQL Server Management Studio. If you're a Mongo person, this would be SQL Server Management Studio. It's how we read and write data. I can come here and see my database and see all my data go in and out. So our, whoops, sorry, I skipped. View models get mapped to these database models and saved. Are they always equal? No. There's some things we never want to go to the client, come back. Take password, for example, in a user. I never want password. Even in an encrypted format, password or any hash, of a password never goes down to the client. There's other endpoints that accept a string password, but it gets hashed and stored and then never to be seen again by the client. So there's a difference between what goes into a database, whether it's relational or not, and the view model that is the surface area of our API. And that is the view models. So our surface area is isolated, and it's up to us to map back and forth. Sometimes that mapping includes renaming. Sometimes it's just the same name. Name first to name first, name last to name last. Rules, there's some validation a lot of places, not just in those attributes. Sometimes we also check it in code, and then it's enforced because back here in the actual data object, we say this is required. But so ultimately, some people say, oh, you've got the same rule applied 10 places or 3 places. Fortunately, yes, we do. There's 3 different technologies that make all this work. So it is what it is. And sometimes we get out of whack and we forget something. We ran into issues lately where I scripted a bunch of data for a big customer of ours, and I wrote some scripts that seeded the database, but my scripts went right through the services, right back to these objects, the data objects, and saved. Filled the database with thousands of rows, sampled data, just tons of stuff. Then my guys on my team are writing mobile apps and front ends hitting it. Well, their front ends are going through the API. Well, there was a disparity between what's required and what's not required if I skip the front end versus if I go through the front end, because I had said something's required or not required here, but it is up here. So they could read stuff but not write it. They're like, I can't write it. Well, I'm like, oh crap, I forgot to make this required in both places. Or I made it not required in the database, but I forgot in the API. So it isn't a perfect world. So now I've started to just write all my seeded data in a script that calls the API so that there's no disparity. If I screw it up in my script, it's going to be the same screw up that these people see when they write the front end code.
But you find it before.
I find it before. But yeah, we got a lot of rules in a lot of places. In our world, we have models, we have view models, we have services. All of our logic goes into services. Now, if you read the Nest documentation, they have services too. We didn't invent this term. We kind of just follow the pattern. But all of our logic, like if I want to send an email, I can inject an email service that will do all my emailing. If I want to read and write, or I want to cache data in Redis, all of that is abstracted and isolated into a cache service. So we can share these services across projects and get a ton of reuse. Those awards, that award topic that we've been talking about is a particular entity that's stored in a database in an awards collection. All reading and writing of that thing goes through an award service, and it caches data appropriately. It might use other services. We also abstract all of our data access into repositories, just like if we were writing in any other framework or any other language. Repositories, and we usually have 1 per collection, 1 per table most of the time. But in here is all of our read, CRUD, read, write, delete, update. We have a base repository. We write TypeScript, so we can still use object-oriented patterns, right? There's nothing that keeps us from inheriting a significant amount of functionality since we're writing in TypeScript. And that goes all the way from controllers to all the other pieces of Nest. Just like if I'm writing Angular, right? On the front end, nice thing about Angular being written in TypeScript is if you're creative, object-oriented concepts do a ton for you. So we leverage them on the back end just like we do the front end.
Does this mean you're never writing more C#?
Still have Xamarin, but I write less C# today than I ever have, honestly, I'm not lying. We still have some Windows Forms projects, don't get me wrong. We still do some Windows Forms. More than anybody in here, I guarantee we see more WinForms code. We hate every minute of it, but it's still there.
You demoed briefly NestCLI, maybe as like plans for.
Oh yeah, create controllers. Just to give you, I won't type them, but and I'll show you. I know I'm running low on time here, but I got a bunch of resources to show you and some other stuff. But NestCLI is its own GitHub repo. That's what I was looking for, official documentation. Well, they have more than just this. Yes, you can create. I don't know why they don't show more. You can create controllers and other stuff. I don't use it as much as I do in Angular to do that stuff because it's just too easy to just create a class. I can create any controller and just drop it anywhere I want. And as long as in the app module, I register it as a controller. When Nest starts, let me stop this and restart it. Whoops. In case I didn't want. Nest is very, whoop. Oh, I got two different things running. But Nest will write out every registration, every map. So when it starts, Nest will do all of the dependency injection, create all your controllers, set everything up in memory, and get everything ready to go on startup. So simplistic view of the world, say this happens at 8 in the morning, right? Every other request that comes into this web server throughout the day is just hitting these things in memory already. So it will handle all of your multi-threading and all of that. And then, so you'll see in excruciating detail what's running where. Turn one of these off. Nope, that one's off. Let me quit these and come back in. Do. We use Redis, we use Mongo, we use MySQL, we use SQL Server. We use a lot of different things. Open it a bunch. Anybody here use WebStorm? You should. I'm a big WebStorm fan. My team would literally leave. It would be a coup. They'd revolt. So this is my Nest. This is me starting all of this in all of these controllers. Everything's mapped on startup. So if I come out here and change, if I just put a return in here and saved, this automatically restarts just like Angular if you did an ngServe, right? It's not necessarily Webpack. It's running NodeMon because it's server side. If I wanted to run Webpack, down here, focus. I have in my package.json, we have a, what would I run? Build. Can I just do an npm build? npm run build dev that will run Webpack. We use Webpack. We became experts in Webpack way before the world abstracted and hid Webpack. So it became a weird skill that most people don't have anymore, but we were really good at it. By doing that, it took all of my code in Webpack, ran it through and put it into a dist folder. So it's no longer TypeScript. It is now converted to JavaScript. So when we do Docker builds, this dist folder is the core of what goes out there. We copy only this. So we can optimize using any Webpack plugin we want if we needed to. We don't generally minify. Why? Because in Node, you don't need to. Because my Docker containers have plenty of room for this little folder, right? I'd rather see, if I get a crash, I'd rather see JavaScript in some readable format. At least I can tell what's going on, as opposed to a completely minified. Performance isn't that, it's critical, but even this is just as fast in Node. In the web world, if I'm doing Angular, I like to minify, strip comments, do all of these things because I care about bandwidth. Bandwidth's a non-issue in Docker. It's just a little bit, a few more K sitting on a server somewhere. So the comments would never run down to a client anyway. A couple more things. What else do I have? We use security. I'll talk about security briefly. I use a tool called Bull. I don't know if you saw Bull. Oops. I'm not running anymore because I stopped. Let me start again. I got some goofy reason. I hate to do this one more time. Questions while it's staying open on me. I'm not sure why.
So when you have this validation on the model, new model,